Welcome to Adventures in Micro Farming. How to set up your own farm, an indoor worm farm and microgreen system. Before we jump in, here's what you need to know. The interactive map that you see in front of you can be found. We will drop the link in, and we are presenting, attending, and hosting this workshop from land that was managed and inhabited before European colonization. Please take a moment to find your location on this map and honor those lands you now occupy. This account is set to mute participants upon entry. So to speak, just click your unmute button. Please mute yourself when you are done speaking to avoid any background noise. Everybody is set to mute right now. Feel free to use the chat feature to comment at any point during the workshop. We will be addressing questions throughout the time. So if there's any questions you have, we'll certainly be happy to share it with Julia and Ben. And this session is being recorded. We have some wonderful, wonderful sponsors that we would love you to peruse. We want to thank all of them for their kind support, which helps us keep this NOFA conference going for the last, 50 years. We also, these are some more of our fantastic NOFA sponsors. And I believe we are done with that. So now let me tell you about who we're presenting. Ben Goldberg has been composting with worms and making worm bins in various configurations since 1995. His academic background is in ecology, renewable resource management, and environmental education. He also has cultivated an odd assortment of experimental backgrounds in woodworking, rural technology, resource reuse, and ecological sanitation. He lives here in the Pioneer Valley of Western Massachusetts, home to some of the best fertile soil on the planet, as far as I'm concerned. We also have Julia Latady joining us. An invertebrate enthusiast. She has worked as an environmental educator for Mass Audubon before building an all-ages education program at a family farm outside of Boston. She has now lived in Ware, where she is currently working to build soil and grow good food with the help from workforce of worms, composting rock cockroaches, and chickens and a rabbit. So go ahead, Julia, take it away.
Oh, great. Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to just share my screen here. So I will be presenting. Ben is here with me. We will do a quick introduction, and then Ben will come back for questions and discussion at the end. All right, so welcome. Can everybody hear me? Just want to make sure I'm unmuted. Yep, okay. Welcome to our presentation tonight, Adventures in Microfarming, how to set up your own small-scale indoor worm farm and microgreen system. My name is Julia Latady. I'm here in Ware, Massachusetts at my home. That's on Nipmuc land, and I've been here for 2 years. When we first arrived, we found that the soil was lacking. It was sandy and rocky, and so the first goal was to build better soil, and from there I've been learning and experimenting, and I have a whole system with different moving parts that I will be talking about today, and we will especially be focusing on microgreens and worms. I'm here with Ben Goldberg. He's been a mentor to me as I have been on this learning journey, and he is a master of many things. One of those things is composting with worms. So I will give him a chance to introduce himself really quickly.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to the to the presentation. I'm excited to see Julia's presentation. I saw some previews. It's really exciting, and so I hope we can all benefit from this, and I'm looking forward to getting started. But again, thanks for being here. And I'll see you at the end for some Q&A.
Thank you. You can also find us on Instagram at We Have Worms if you want to follow some of the antics that we've been up to. I just want to let everybody know that we will be taking questions at the end. So as we go, if a question pops up, feel free to write that out in the chat, and Fern will help facilitate at the end. We'll try to answer everybody's questions. A little bit of an overview of what we will be going over this evening. What do we mean by microfarming? We will dive into some examples of the microfarm system that I've been creating here in Ware. Deeper dive into vermicompost, and then into microgreens, and then how to tie those two together into a smaller recycling system. And then we will open it up to any questions and discussion after that. And here is our mascot of the evening, Bunny Sanders, very important part of the system. So I know it's a little strange being remote and virtual, but I was thinking it would be great to have anyone who wants to put just quickly in the chat, where are you coming from? And where are you in terms of understanding what microfarming is, or even doing any microfarming yourself? So are you completely new to this? You don't even know what I'm talking about yet? Maybe you're a consumer, but you've never actually grown or managed any livestock. Maybe you are a gardener, you try to buy local things sustainably, but wouldn't consider yourself a farmer. Great. Or maybe you're microfarming, you don't know what it is yet, so you don't know. Or are you actively farming on a small footprint, and maybe you can share a little bit more about that or other. So I'll give everybody just a minute to add that in the chat. I will see. Can I even open the chat? There it is. All right, so we have a gardener. Great. Couple more seconds. Awesome. Getting some more. Cambridge. I used to live out that area. Now I'm in Western Mass, right by the Quabbin. Connecticut. Another gardener. 2, 3. Love it. Someone has worms. Okay. Someone familiar with microfarming. Great. Great, these are wonderful. This is giving me a sense of who's out there and who I'm talking to as I talk into the void. Oh, wow, we have someone with a composting worm business. So hopefully maybe you can teach us some things at the end, and then this is great. Hopefully we can learn from you too. I'm interested in the microgreens because those tie in together really nicely. Berries, unusual fruits, very cool. All right, I am going to move on. Feel free to add more into the chat, but I will just keep us moving here. So what, there we go. What is microfarming? Microfarming is intensive food production on a small footprint. It may be done indoors, outdoors, or a mixture of both. Since you're using a smaller amount of space, there's a focus on efficiency and also maybe on specialty crops or specialty livestock. So probably doesn't make much sense to farm conventional sweet corn on a small footprint, but something a little bit more niche, such as heritage pork or quail for eggs, microgreens. I think someone in the conference is presenting on crocuses for saffron. That kind of thing will really distinguish you. And if you're farming for sale, to increase profit margins and make it all worthwhile. But it also allows people who don't have access to land or to a large amount of space, or maybe to the upfront capital to start a farm or purchase land, allows people a chance to grow their own food. And when I look at microfarming, I see an opportunity to pull together aspects of permaculture. You can find ways to stack functions, look at what works, what kinds of systems you can put into place where you are and with what you have. And yeah, an opportunity to create ways for people to grow their own food, no matter how much space they have. The benefits, of course, you don't need much space. Some people start on just a windowsill, or even if you're growing microgreens, or in a closet, or with the backyard that you have. Transform your lawn into a farm. Use vertical space for efficiency. And then, of course, on a practical note, there is better control if you are growing indoors, better control over the elements, over lighting, humidity levels, temperature, and pest mitigation. So let's get started. Like we said, we don't need much space. This is a picture of the space that I started with for microgreens and worms. It's an upstairs bedroom that wasn't being used. So using your space efficiently, stacking on shelves. I only have these shelves 3 high, but there are opportunities to go higher so that you're really utilizing the space that you have. Making sure that you have water access. Rain barrel might be a good option for you if you're to collect water off the roof, assuming that you are using a building. And then considering where the space is it upstairs, is it in a basement, that you will be needing to lug materials and water to that space. So just considering the location, considering the cleanliness of whether you will be spilling water. So you see here, I have the tarp. And then having access to the supplies. So we will get a little bit into what supplies you need to get started in a bit. And then creativity is really important. What do you want to grow? What do you want to specialize in? And how can you tie those things together efficiently so that you're creating a system? And as an example, here is an illustration of the system that we've created here in Ware. So like I said, we started with focusing on the soil. We wanted to build better soil. And the way I knew how to do that was to start with compost. So I started with an outdoor thermophilic composting system. I tapped into our community. Many people out here were throwing away their food waste into the trash. And I was able to connect with some people who would give me their food waste and other waste products, cardboard, packaging materials especially, to compost outdoors, but then also to compost with the worms. And that soil, the compost then goes into building soil, which I use to grow microgreens, a seasonal garden, which provides food for us, also provides food for our chickens, our laying hens, and for our rabbit, who is not a meat rabbit, but he does give us manure. And that manure goes right back into the compost and into the vermicomposting system. So it creates this circle, this flow. The microgreens, when they are done, I also oftentimes will put those back into the vermicompost, the spent trays, or into the thermophilic compost, and we'll focus on that a little bit more later. I'll get to the details. And then just a fun part of the cycle, not full aquaponics, but experimenting that way. We do have an aquatic axolotl who eats worms and then creates some dirty water, some nitrate-rich water for us to water crops. We don't put that on the microgreens or leafy greens, just there is a risk of contamination, but he helps with the some of the plants in the garden, and then of course the houseplants. And then some new additions to the system are the composting cockroaches. So bladder composting is the fancy word for composting with cockroaches. And I brought them in partly because I always wanted to have cockroaches, because I think bugs are cool, but also because I wanted to experiment with ways to compost meat more efficiently. And so the cockroaches will turn that community waste into protein, which then goes to the chickens. They also create a little bit of manure, which goes back into creating soil. Another new aspect to our system is growing gourmet mushrooms. We've been growing gourmet lion's mane and oyster mushrooms. And I do it low tech mushroom growing, so it's very easy, and I use community waste, coffee grounds, spent coffee grounds, and cardboard. And those mushrooms become food for us and for people in our lives, our community, for barter. And then the spent substrate goes right back into the compost, and especially into the vermicompost. So that's a little bit of our system. And just to give you an idea, but tonight we are really focusing on a smaller system within the system. We're focusing on the vermiculture, the vermicomposting, and the microgreen growing. Vermicompost is just a fancy word for composting with worms. Worm poop is called castings, the worm manure, and they contain beneficial microbes which help build soil structure, boost the soil vitality. They are filled with fungus, little microscopic fungus and microscopic bacteria, beneficial for building plant resistance to disease and building resistance against pests. They also increase plant growth rate and yield. So a little goes a long way with vermicompost, adding it to the soil. And I like to think of vermicompost as, well, conventional fertilizer is more like fast food. Vermicompost or castings are more like a rich, complex, home-cooked meal. So they really stay with the plant longer, they're healthier for your plants, and they help to create, they help the plant network with the fungus that is in the soil and to build relationships with other plants in the area more than a conventional fertilizer can. And with worm composting, you can really start small. You can start as small as a shoebox size under the sink, with the opportunity to scale up for a larger volume of food or larger output goals. And the worms that we compost with are called red wigglers. Scientific name Asania fetida. You might see red wigglers that are different. The red wiggler common name is used for some other species, but we are focusing on the Asania fetida because they are voracious eaters. They play well with their friends. They do well in a bin in close quarters, and they like to eat at the surface. So you don't need a deep bin for the worms to burrow up and down through. They are feeding at the surface, and they are going through compost quite quickly. They can eat half their body weight in a day of compost, and sometimes even more. We do have a little video. This is Ben, and to give you a sense of why they are called red wigglers.
Worms?
I get a worm. Yeah, there he goes. I just wanted to see why it's called red wigglers. They just jump all over the place.
Uh-huh.
Check this.
There you go. You can see that little wiggle dance. So red wigglers, each worm is hermaphroditic, so they are both male and female, but they do need to mate. They need to go through sexual reproduction to mate. So you need two worms, and then each worm will produce a cocoon, and they will shed it off along their body and deposit it. And the cocoons will have baby worms, or the eggs of the baby worms inside. Generally, we see 3 worms to a cocoon, but there can be more or fewer. They start out off the worm a light color, and then they darken as they get ready to hatch. And then you'll see cocoons in the bin that have already hatched. They'll have a little hole in them. You can get a sense of the size there next to the penny. And the worms, in ideal conditions, worm population can double in 60 to 90 days, depending on your conditions. And they also have the ability to self-regulate depending on the size of their container. So they won't overpopulate the bin. The population will regulate itself depending on the size and then the food source available to them. So let's build or buy your first worm bin. We'll talk a little bit about how to set up the bin, how to feed the worms, and how to maintain ideal levels for them. And so if you don't want to start out by buying a bin, you can build a bin. And this is actually an example of a little bit of a step up from a simple bin. A simple bin would just be a Rubbermaid container with some holes drilled around the sides. But the number one issue we see with new worm wranglers is that they overfeed and they create conditions where the food in the bin starts to break down anaerobically and starts to create leachate, which can be really stinky and unpleasant and make you never want to have a worm bin ever again. And so we try to avoid that. But if you're overfeeding and that does happen and you're getting the leachate, having a bin with a catch system or a reservoir can really help to then drain the leachate out so that you're not having the worms just sit in the leachate and be uncomfortable and you're not smelling it. So to get started with that, you'll need a plastic bin, food safe is best, a drill, and then we'll get into what bedding materials and grit are in a bit. So here is some step-by-step photos. You want to add the holes along the side of the bin, and that will allow for airflow. If you want to get a little fancier, you can put vents in the bin because these holes, technically you could get critters coming in and out of the bin, like ants or spiders or worms could escape, but that usually isn't too much of an issue. And if you are not interested in building your bin, there are many options of bins to buy online. There are bins that are the like a tote bin size with a false floor reservoir so that you can drain that leachate out. They have the ventilation as well with screens so that you're not getting any undesired critters in there. If you're going for a slightly larger scale, having a flow-through bin or a linear migration bin can be really handy, and we'll get into harvesting later and why that is so. But there are options out there for a larger bin for larger quantities of food. And then there just another example is the urban worm bag, and that is made with breathable fabric. I've never tried it myself, but I know some people that like it. I know Ben is not a big fan, but just some options that are out there. You feed from the top and harvest from a zippered bottom. But so if you have your bin, you're ready to get started, we need to put in bedding. So we can't just put food in. It will start to smell. So we give the worms bedding so that they can move through, find their food, and it retains moisture. We want bedding that can retain moisture well. Materials that work really well are leaves. Just fall leaves are a great free resource. The downside to that is that you oftentimes will get some other creatures entering your bin. So that's really just up to your tolerance of the ecosystem. A worm bin is not just worms and food. It is a ecosystem with lots of little microscopic players and sometimes macroscopic players as well. So you might see centipedes, you might see spiders, you might see potworms or another type of worm species that you might see in there. And so it's really up to what is your tolerance for that ecosystem. Bringing in leaves from outdoors, you will get more friends in the bin. You'll probably have some spiders and some moths. But you can also start with some aged manure mixed in with compost works really well. Some not fully finished compost, but some composted materials, so leaves and food and manure. We also use coffee chaff from Dean's Beans. So just the idea of finding what's out there in your community, what are some free resources you can have access to that you can add to your bin. A really popular one is shredded newspaper or shredded cardboard, or even the packing paper that comes in packages now. The caveat to that is anything with ink. You want to try to avoid inks, especially colored inks, although some people choose to use them anyways. And if you are using cardboard, it can be really hard to shred, but if you soak it overnight and then shred it, is much easier. So usually a mixture of those materials works really well, especially if you can pre-compost it. Worms also need a grit source for their digestion. They eat sort of like a baleen whale, moving through the soil, and just anything that's there enters into their mouth and then goes down into a gizzard, just like a bird where the grit is in there helping them break down material so that they can further digest it. So having some sand in your bin, some crushed eggshells or pulverized eggshells, or even just some native dirt from your area work really well. Where to find some worms? Right now, worms are actually more expensive than they've been in a while. It seems like vermicomposting is getting popular, which is great, but it also means it can be harder to find worms. So there are many places online that you can find worms. The Urban Worm Farm has, I believe they actually source their worms from Meme's worms. Cousins Compost also has worms, and then Uncle Jim's is where I got my worms from way back when. And so that's another option. You can also check out some local listings. So Craigslist, listservs, putting it out to your community, seeing if anyone has worms that they want to share with you. You can try bait shops and pet stores, although be careful because sometimes they sell red wigglers that are not Sania fetida. And if you are buying worms, you might see that some online retailers are listing worms that are not red wigglers or Sania fetida. They're listing euros and blues. And those are other composting species. They can work well. The upside to red wigglers is that they have a higher temperature range tolerance, especially the Indian or Malaysian blues. They're more tropical species, so they tend to like the upper ends of the spectrum. Getting a mix tends to be cheaper, and also it can be beneficial to have that diversity in your bin, and then the worms that are well suited to your environment and your conditions will do well, and the ones that aren't as well suited won't do as well, so it helps to balance it out. But a downside to the blues, which I've never had them, so I've never experienced this myself, but I have heard that they have a habit of escaping before thunderstorms. Something about the pressure, they sense it and they think they need to get up high. And so I've heard some people have an issue where they have a mass exodus from their bin. So that could be a downside. It can be hard to tell the worms apart, but red wiggler will have that, the adult red wiggler will have that raised clitellum and the prominent banding and the yellow tail. So you have your bin, it's all set up. You have your worms, they're ready to go. And now we need to know how to feed them. So I think I mentioned already that they'll consume about half their body weight in food each day. They have a preference for raw fruit and veggie scraps. The smaller the food, the greater the surface area, and the quicker it will break down, the quicker the microbes will be able to process it and decompose it to make it more accessible to the worms. So to accomplish that, you can chop up your food. Ideally, you can grind it up, put it in a food processor. If you are doing a larger operation, Ben has a wood chipper, a modified wood chipper that he uses to shred the food, or even freezing the food can help with that process. It helps to break the cell walls down. And that has the added benefit of it helps break pest cycles. If, for example, banana peels, the worms love banana peels, but big downside to banana peels is that you oftentimes get fruit fly eggs in the peel. So freezing that can help to break that pest cycle, can help to kill the eggs. Now, if you have a small bin, you have limited real estate, and well, worms will eventually get to many items, especially if you're keeping your bin indoors. There are some things that you might not want to feed. So spicy foods, onions, garlic, they don't decompose as quickly. Hot peppers, not a great idea for a small indoor bin. Acidic foods such as citrus or pineapple, not so much. Baked goods, if they tend to generate like a mold and create anaerobic conditions too quickly and are not always processed as quickly by the worms and are not as favored. And then clumpy cooked foods such as oatmeal for the same reason, although you can add uncooked oatmeal and that can help boost the fungal population of the bin. And it can also help if the bin is too wet to help suck up some moisture. And then of course, meat and dairy can attract pests and can also, especially uncooked, can bring pathogens into the bin. So generally best to avoid these for an indoor small bin. And keeping the worms happy. So the bedding should be about as wet as a wrung out sponge. So if you grab a handful of the bedding and squeeze, it should clump together, it shouldn't crumble, but it shouldn't drip out moisture. It should have just a little bit of moisture coming out. They prefer a pretty neutral pH, 6 to 7. I don't think that you need to be testing the pH every day unless that's something you want to do, but you can sometimes tell if the bin becomes too acidic. You might see the worms starting to escape. You might also smell the bin, and generally wetter conditions can also go in line with more acidic conditions. You might also see some pests, like some mites. Mites are also part of the decomposing process, but we oftentimes don't want too many. So you might see more of those showing up in your bin. If you need to change the pH, oftentimes if it's getting too acidic, oftentimes ground up eggshells can also help with that. And the red wigglers would like their bin to be from 50 to 80 degrees. Any colder than that, they're not as productive. And any hotter, and they can start to, they don't thrive in that either. They prefer darkness. Their skin is photosensitive, so if they are exposed to light, it's very uncomfortable for them and they try to find darkness. So ideally bins with dark sides or kept in a dark location are best for them. And then of course, avoid salts, as salinity can burn their skin. Oops, I keep doing that. And if you are starting a worm bin, I recommend taking out some worm insurance. So as you're learning how to properly manage a worm bin, it's possible something could go drastically wrong. It has happened to me before. I put too much rabbit manure and it got too hot and lost all my worms. And you can cause your worm colony to collapse. So take out a worm insurance policy by convincing any friends or family and neighbors to start their own worm bins. That way, if something goes wrong with one of your bins, you can help each other out by supplying worms. Same idea, you can have multiple bins at your house. And why do we like to raise worms? What are the rewards? What do we get from the castings? How do we harvest the castings? And then what do we do with them? So we did talk a little bit about the benefits of the worm castings. They help to increase the microbial diversity and abundance in the soil when added. They are water soluble and slow release fertilizer. They do not cause nutrient burn, and a little goes a long way. So in soils, it's been found adding 10 to 20% vermicast to soil will give you the greatest benefit, and you really don't need more than that. So they're richer in nutrients than compost oftentimes and require a lower application rate. For more information about the castings, I recommend going to the University of California site that I have the link here, and then we also have the link in resources. It's a great resource to look at. So when you are ready to harvest, you've been feeding and the worms have processed the bedding and the food, and you are left with vermicast. There are some different ways to harvest. One that works particularly well for a smaller bin is the light avoidance method. And basically all you do is on a sunny day or under a bright light, set up a table or a tarp and something that can get dirty and just dump your bin on it. And any worms that are exposed to the light will burrow into the bedding. And at that point, you can start to scrape away the top layer of castings until you begin to see worms again. And then give them a break, they'll burrow back in and repeat. So it is a very thorough method of harvesting castings, especially if you're keeping an eye out for any cocoons and any baby worms, but it is time consuming and a higher effort. You do need to keep coming back again and again, depending on how many castings you have to harvest. And so here's some photos of a light avoidance harvest that I did recently. You can see the big pile here of the vermicast. There's some other, some debris that hasn't been fully processed. So as I'm harvesting, I can go through and pick that out, put it back into the worm bin. And then we have our finished castings here and a little straggler worm. And then another benefit of this method is you're left at the end with a ball of worms. And so you can get a sense of how many worms you have in that bin. How is the population growing? Is it decreasing? How do the worms look? And you can weigh them if you want to track your feedings. Especially if you're on if you're doing this at a larger scale, the linear migration method tends to work really well. And that is, I'll go through the pros and cons first, and then we'll move on to the next slide to see some images as I explain it. It's not as time consuming, but it does take a lot of passive time. So it works well for if you have a larger scale system, but it's not as thorough. The longer you wait as you're letting the worms migrate, the more thorough it will be, but there are always going to be some dawdlers or cocoons or babies left behind. And it does tend to take up more space because it's generally a larger system. So here's an example of a flow through bin. You can see this bin has this is it on its side. It has these 4 sections, and each section is divided by a hardware cloth mesh. The worms can move through the mesh into the next section. And so one section is filled with food and bedding until it's filled up to the top. And one thing I didn't mention is when you're feeding, it works really well to dig a little hole in the bedding, add the food in, and then cover it up. That can help prevent any pests from getting to the food first. So you're adding bedding as you go, you're adding food as you go. We've gotten to the top. All these castings have been created underneath this top layer. And then you can start feeding in the next section, and the worms will start to migrate towards the fresh food and the fresh bedding. And the idea is that they will leave the old castings behind. So here's our bin with the lid on. And of course, that if you let the process take a long time, you can get those stragglers, more and more of those stragglers, but it doesn't always happen. So we have a video here of Ben doing some sifting from the finished vermicast as he's transferring it, as he's harvesting it into the bucket, and you'll see that there are some stragglers left behind.
I'm just kind of quickly sifting through it. The worms.
Is that one in your hand too, or is that just a mountain?
A little crater. Here's one here. But like, oh, here's one. But very few compared to. We only just started, I think it's 2 weeks since we did this, started the second bin. There's a few in there.
Great, so we've harvested our castings, and now what do we do with them? You can top dress them directly onto your plants, including house plants, just a little handful sprinkled around. Add to potting mixes or add to your soil building mix, so that 10 to 20% ratio to potting mix works really well. Stretch it further by making a vermicompost tea, as simple as just adding water to the vermicast and then spreading that out, or you can step it up a notch and do an aerated tea. And we actually have a video on the website of the steps to creating an actively aerated compost tea. A common misconception, a lot of people call the leachate, that's the liquid at the bottom of the bin, if the bin is overfed, they call that the worm tea or the compost tea. That is leachate. Compost tea is the finished product added to water or actively aerated. So just a little distinction there. And of course, you can use it to grow microgreens. Right now I'm growing, I like to use coco coir and vermicast. So I am buying in coco coir, and I'm still experimenting with the ratios, but right now I'm doing 2/3 coco coir to 1/3 vermicast. And that seems to be working pretty well. And so microgreens are leafy greens that are in their first few weeks of growth. So it's the first cotyledons, the first leaves, up to the first true leaf is when you harvest. And they're especially nutrient dense, all that nutrition from the seed and then from the soil around them. They are very flavorful, and there's a quick turnaround from planting to harvest, so you get to eat them quickly. They're great for growing in small spaces, especially if you are optimizing your vertical space and growing on shelves or racks. And a wide variety of plants can be grown as microgreens. So all sorts of flavors and textures and colors out there. And I like to use my microgreens in stir fries, especially pea shoots are great for stir fries. Add to a salad for some added color. Cheese plates makes you feel really fancy when you have some microgreens on a cheese plate. Added nutrition to a smoothie. Taco toppings are really toppings for anything as a garnish, even for desserts. Sandwich greens, and honestly, even just as a healthy snack, I have eaten microgreens straight as I watched a movie instead of popcorn. And that's coming from someone who loves popcorn. So they are really good, and it's not just for fancy chefs. Anyone has access to this. Here is my setup. I actually have two spaces, one upstairs and one in the basement, just experimenting with some different conditions. I have an old greenhouse shelving that I've converted into the microgreen racks, and I use these LED shop lights. They were not too expensive and they're very efficient and they don't put off any heat. I use dental floss to string them up. And something that's a bit of a luxury are these GoSun smart plugs. They help, I have my microgreens on a timer so that I don't have to go upstairs or downstairs every night to turn them off late at night and wake up super early to turn them on. That's not necessary, but it is a luxury because the microgreens do need at least 6 hours of light, but then they also enjoy a dark period as well. Fans for air circulation help prevent mold. Watering system, I use spray bottles, and then this hand pump works really well for the bottom watering. And then these trays are called 1020 trays. And it's a one shallow tray with holes that stacks inside a deeper tray. That works really well. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I do have it in the resource sheet, but this is a cost breakdown of some of the items that I have. The lights, the 1020 trays. One thing I do want to say is if you do want to get started with the scale of growing, and you do want to buy the 1020 trays, I recommend Bootstrap Farmer because they have a sturdier tray and they also sell the shallow tray. So you're using less soil and the trays are lasting longer. It is a price, though. It is a little bit more expensive. And then I use, as my cocoa core, I use Plantonic's Cocoa Bliss. It comes in compressed bricks, so it's easier to store. It's not taking up much space. And then with hydration, it expands. And I do all that mixing in a bucket. I use water from a rain barrel outside. And then seeds, price varies depending on how many you're buying and where you're buying them from and what plant you're buying. But I like to use True Leaf Market or Johnny Seeds. And if anyone has any specific questions about materials, I am more than happy to answer those. But do you need a fancy setup to get started? No. And I actually got started doing this because I had been managing my worm bin and I noticed that every once in a while the worms would grow microgreens, especially cantaloupe. They would like to grow cantaloupe microgreens. And I thought, hey, can I manage this and grow microgreens for food? Started looking into it, but didn't want to launch right in and decided I could get started with the containers I already had around. So that this berry container is just a raspberry container, used raspberry container. It's great because it has the holes for drainage and for bottom watering. And these are some peas that I grew in it that were ready to find new land. pie pans or cake pans. This is a disposable cake pan. Caveat to that I don't know that much about is water reacting with the aluminum. So I definitely would move more towards the berry containers, or plastic takeout containers work really well as well. So you don't need much to get started, but you do need to find some seeds. I would say start with an easy grow. Brassica species tend to be a good starting point. So broccolis, cauliflower, mustards, kale, so highly nutritious and pretty easy to get started. Clover, I've never grown myself, but it is considered an easier grow. Lettuce is very easy. It germinates above the soil, so you don't need that stacking period or the blackout period, which I'll explain a little bit more later, but not the most exciting microgreen to eat. And then radish is a nice, easy crop to grow and really flavorful, really spicy. So as you choose your seeds, consider what flavors do you want, or if you're looking to sell, what flavors do your customers or friends or family want? Are you looking for any colors, any specific tastes? And then making sure that you're buying from reputable seed sources, because as you're growing plants so close together, they are more susceptible to mold, especially if you're not getting the right airflow, or if density, if you're still working on your seeding density. So you don't want to start with a seed that already has been contaminated. That's just going to get you off on the wrong foot. And then consider the costs. Of course, if you buy in bulk, you're going to save money, but don't buy in bulk unless you know that that is a crop that you want to grow. So you're going to start off just trying some things out, seeing what works for you, and then you can try to make some more cost-effective choices. I do have a video of how to using these 10-20 trays. We are going to be planting some microgreens. So we have our supplies here. We have our seeds, 7 to 8 grams of the spicy brassica mix. It's a mix of mustard seeds. It has a nice spicy taste when it's done. We have our spray bottle and our 10-20 trays. So I have this shallow tray that inserts into the bigger tray. The shallow one has the holes, which allows for drainage, but also allows the roots of the microgreens to wick water up from the tray below. I have my soil already mixed. It's a mixture of 2/3 cocoa coir to 1/3 vermicast. And we're just gonna put this right in the tray here. Lose too much. Spread it out and tamp it down lightly. That helps to allow the microgreen roots to access water as they grow, or try to create a nice even surface here. So I have the soil nice and tamped down. I'm removing any debris. Patty is pitching in here. She's the quality control committee. And I have my seeds. I've weighed them out already, and it's just going to be a sprinkling across the surface. And I like to make sure I'm low enough that they are hitting the soil and not just bouncing off. But if you can get a little higher, it can help control the evenness. And this is just practice as you go. I am losing some over the sides. I'm trying not to. And you can take a look at the density here. If you see any spots that are much more dense than others, you can sort of just spread it around with a finger like that. So we have our seeds spread evenly across the soil. The next step is to spray them with some water, and that helps them settle into the soil and gives them some moisture so that they can then begin their germination. Nice. Even spraying. Once that's done, we will put another tray on top. This is called stacking. And normally I would have this tray also planted with microgreens, and adding that on top of the first tray will add an even weight. 3 to 7 pounds is ideal for this species of microgreen, for the spicy brassica mix. And it helps the seeds, as they germinate, it helps the roots go down and the stems meet some resistance as they come up. So it allows for a sturdier and more even crop. So in this case, we don't have another heavy tray, but if I were planting a whole set of microgreens, I would have another tray on top. In about 2 to 3 days, as these seeds germinate, it would be time for the blackout period, and you would just take another tray, flip it over, put it down over the top, and that gives the seeds will start to try to grow towards the light, not find any light because they're in this blackout dome, and grow taller. At which point you would open it up, expose them to the light, and they would start to green up and be ready for harvest in just a couple of days. Right. I did see a question come in, and I'm reading some of the questions, and we will get to them at the end. I saw one come in about the lights, and I did mean to mention that great thing about microgreens is you're not getting into the flower or the fruit stage, and so they really don't need a full spectrum of light. So LED lights work really well as long as they're above 4,500 lumens, I believe it is, and I think it's pretty easy to get them even higher than that. Works. They're not too expensive, but you can also, if you're growing outdoors, use the sun. And even if you're growing indoors in a sunny location, that tends to work. That works really well as well. So a great resource is bootstrapfarmer.com. That is where I got the trays from. They have lots of information on how to start your microgreens, FAQs, troubleshooting, and then they have this awesome cheat sheet for a variety of microgreen species with a key of whether that plant is easy, medium, or hard to grow, whether it needs a humidity dome, if you can do a second harvest, is it mold prone, and then the weight that you would need for various growing sizes. And do a little run through of one plant, which is a pea shoots. They are medium difficulty. That's because one of the steps involved is soaking, and it's a little bit of an extra step. They are very nutritious. They are mold prone. Back to that soaking period, that does tend to creates a condition that is great for mold if there's already mold on the seeds. But they are quick to harvest, and a second harvest is possible as long as you leave a leaf at the base of the stem as you harvest. And we will go over how to harvest in a few. And I find that peas work really well. I'll harvest once, I'll harvest twice, and then the third harvest goes straight to the rabbit or the chickens, and they finish it off for me, and then the trays get cycled back into the system. Here's a example of just a photo of some peas in various states. So these are a little wild at this point, but the earlier you harvest them, the more tender they are. But of course, the longer you wait, the more yield you'll get. So I also recommend, if you're growing, taste a little bit every day as it gets close to the harvest, and decide what tastes best to you, what is the ideal harvest day. And that will change based on soil conditions. It will change based on temperature, but it will help give you an idea of when you need to harvest each crop. Just another peas as they're starting to grow. So harvesting your microgreens, using clean, sharp scissors or a knife. I personally prefer to use scissors, but that's because I harvest as I go. So I'll bring a tray up to the kitchen and harvest as I need it. But if I'm harvesting and needing them to last in the fridge, a sharp knife is better. So if I'm bringing the microgreens someplace else or giving them to somebody else, sharp knife is best because it's actually a cleaner cut. So you're not tearing as much as you are with scissors, you're cutting, and that slows down their decomposition because you're creating less surface area for decomposition. So harvest, grasp a cluster of the greens in one hand, give it a slight twist, and then cut. and then repeat as you go. It's cut just above the soil surface at the base of the stem. And like we said with peas, with certain grasses, wheatgrass, I grow ryegrass for the animals. Those are cut and come again for multiple harvests. So here's just a little quick visual here. So I harvest the microgreens. These are leek microgreen with clean hands. Grab a chunk, a light twist, and snip. Right, and with microgreens, there are some common issues. A big one tends to be damping off, which is caused by fungus or visible mold. You can mitigate that by increasing airflow, so making sure that you have a fan going, decreasing density, seed density, maybe you've planted too close together. Also checking your humidity levels, so humidity ideally is below 70%. Temperatures ideally are at 65 to 75 degrees, although a little bit warmer at germination and then a little bit cooler as they grow. Poor germination is often caused by, if it is a plant that wants compression or stacking at the start, it's often caused by uneven weight, or it can also be your seed might just not have your source of seed might not have a good germination. So check into that. Make sure that your soil is not staying soggy, but that it is well watered. And that's why I like these trays that insert into another tray that have the bottom holes. It allows for bottom watering. So I add the water to the bottom tray and then it is wicked up through the roots or into the soil of the top tray. And that helps keep the leaves themselves and the stems themselves from getting wet, which would promote mold. And microgreens are also quite fragile, so it also helps keep them safe as I'm watering. Etiolation or stretching towards light, that usually means that you either need to move your light source closer, or if you're growing outdoors or on a windowsill, you need to move your plants closer to the light, or maybe you just aren't getting enough hours of light a day. So you do need at least 6 hours of light a day. And some growers keep the lights on constantly, but some people have done little casual studies on that and claim that giving the plants a rest period of darkness overnight actually improves flavor. So I give mine, I think I'm giving them 8 hours of darkness right now. So a little quiz for everybody in the chat. One of the most common questions growing microgreens is it mold? So what do you think? Is A mold, B mold, or are they both mold? And feel free to just add that into the chat. See how we go. And I'll just answer a question that I see in the chat right now as we answer growing microgreens versus sprouting in jars. So the difference is that sprouting is soilless and you are eating them. I don't sprout, so someone else can correct me if this is not a thorough enough answer, but eating them in the first few days right after germination versus microgreens are allowing those the cotyledons to grow and sometimes even the true leaf to grow, and oftentimes using a soil. All right, so we're getting a both, B, 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 B. Wow, nice, lots of B's. So, yep, you're right. A is not mold, B is mold. A, that's actually the roots. The roots come out first and move down before the stem comes out, and those are the little root hairs that we oftentimes don't see because they're under the soil. Of course, microgreens are germinating on the soil surface, so you will see them, and sometimes it can look like mold. But if you water and they start to disappear, they start to tamp down to the stem, it's not mold. If you see something that looks a little bit more cobwebby, sometimes has black specks in it, or is a different color, like a green or a black, that's probably mold. So the one, the second photo, B, has a more cobwebby appearance, and that is mold. Here's another photo of the root hairs. So how do we put those microgreens back into the system? A spent tray, a tray that has been harvested. All the soil is now filled with the roots, and then we have the seed hulls and the stems, and that is great food for the worms. So I oftentimes will put it right back into the worm bin. They'll help process the roots and core into fresh vermicast. Of course, making sure that any trays that have contamination, I would be a little bit more cautious and put those out into the outdoor compost so that they are going through that thermophilic process. And then I oftentimes will feed finished trays to the chickens as a special nutritious treat. And then of course the rabbit gets his pea shoots, and we grow grass for him as well so that he can provide some healthy manure for our system. And here's a photo of a tray that has been dumped into a worm bin, and you can see those roots. This is a tray that we harvested actually pretty early, so sometimes the roots will be much more extensive, but the worms really love to hang out in there. Oops. I guess it's a video, but we don't need to watch that. So back to our system. We just talked about the microgreens and the vermicompost, but it's of course not a perfect circle. It's not a perfect closed loop, but we are trying to close our loops as much as possible. And we are getting our community food waste. Here's my wood chip sauna, but those wood chips are then, we create outdoor mushroom beds for wine cap mushrooms. We get the coffee waste, just coffee ground waste, so different from the coffee chaff, which was you have to get it specifically from a roaster, but coffee grounds you can get from any coffee shop or from your own, although fresh is best so that they're not getting any competing fungal species. But growing the oyster mushrooms, we get all sorts of great food from the community that would have otherwise gone in the trash, which the chickens are very grateful for, and the cockroaches. This is one of our cockroaches here. It's a cave cockroach from South America. Happy to talk about bladder composting if anyone's interested. And then there's the axolotl eating his worm. So now it's your turn. Please feel free to reach out with any questions, any comments right now in the chat, but then also into the future. We would love to see any photos that you have of your setup and answer any questions if you decide to start your own microgreen and vermicast system.
Thank you, Julia. Do you want me to read through some of the questions?
Sure. So I also just wanted to add, we do have the handout available to participants, which has some resources. We have some helpful links on our website. I also, if anyone's a podcast person, there's a great Growing Microgreens podcast. Forums can be really helpful. Reddit forums, permaculture forums can help answer questions and see what other people are doing. Of course, the Bootstrap Farmer Guides and the Urban Worm Company have extensive resources on their sites. And if you're interested in compost tea, then the Compost Tea Lab is a great place to go. So,
great.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right, so Casey was asking, I grew microgreens with peat and castings, but ended up with lots of tiny flies. How can I avoid this?
Yes, that has happened to me before. And unfortunately, you can definitely get like an infestation, and it can be really hard to control. If that happens and you do have some sort of circular system, don't keep feeding the circle. You need to cut that. But fungus gnats, they can be managed with yellow sticky traps, changing out soil, and also if you there are mosquito dunks that you can use. I prefer to just use the sticky traps, get the adult stage, and try to break that cycle. But I have had that happen before, and I wasn't able to cycle my soil through the worm bins because it just exacerbated the pest problem. But they aren't going to harm you. They're more of a nuisance. And they can harm plants over time. The larvae of the fungus gnats can start to eat the roots and break the roots down, but in a microgreen system, it's not going to hurt your crop. So it's more of just a nuisance.
Great.
I can add to that.
Oh, sure.
The mosquito dunks contain a bacteria, BTI bacteria, which predate on the larva of the fungus gnats and fruit flies and mosquito larvae, actually, which is where they get their name. But the dunks are large discs, and you put them in, you immerse them in the water, and the bacteria is released into your water course. I used, it's the same as the dunk, it's that you can get them also in smaller granules, which make it a little bit more accessible to a smaller system like that. But the reason the fungus gnats are attracted to overly moist conditions and conditions that get a little bit acidic. So you could double check your environment for that.
They love microgreen trays because it's a constant source of food and moisture.
Yeah.
So it does get a little bit persistent. Yeah, it's a tricky one.
You actually answered all the other questions within the presentation. So I'm wondering if anybody else has any questions. Feel free to unmute yourself.
I like to make a fruit fly trap
Ah, yes.
with old wine and a plastic bag with a hole in it, and the fruit flies go in there, and I just leave it up on my kitchen counter all the time. So I'm getting regular fruit flies, not just from my worm bins, but
Yep, those are great. I have one going in the kitchen as well. I like to do the funnel method.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a piece of paper that you fold into a funnel. So it's like a lobster trap. They can go in, but they have a harder time coming out. So yeah, those are great. They don't work for fungus gnats though. Have you? Yeah, fruit flies. That
fruit flies.
but the fungus gnats aren't interested. But yellow sticky paper works really well for the fungus gnats for the adults.
Anybody else have any questions?
If you're not doing worms right away and you just wanted to start out with microgreens, what would you add instead of the vermicastings?
Good question. You can use a potting soil. So there are many options for that. And I'm not super familiar with what's the best soil for growing microgreens, but there are a lot of resources on that. Some people grow with soilless, so that's another option. And some people grow just in the cocoa core. I personally have found that you're not getting as high of a yield and you're not getting as good of a taste. And I don't think it's as nutritious because microgreens, unlike the sprouts, are actually pulling up nutrition from the soil. They're not just getting what was left of them in the seed packet. So if there's not that much nutrition in the soil, they won't be as nutritious, and the vermicast really adds to that. There is actually there's cocoa coir that you can buy online that comes with vermicast in it, so that's another option, or just buying vermicast, buying cocoa coir, mixing those together.
And if you wanted to, you could just like start out like on a balcony or something.
Definitely.
Right now, this time of year.
Definitely. Yep. Microgreens, of course, are a little bit more sensitive, so just making sure that the tray is not drying out or that they're not getting too hot or burnt by the sun, and then they're more subjective to getting attacked by pests. So those are some considerations.
Okay, I'm just thinking out loud. What would you do to avoid them getting too hot?
Making sure that you're watering, checking the water, because you're using not as much soil, so it can dry out much more quickly. And then providing a shade source or putting them in an area where they're not getting full direct sun all day long.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Of course.
Okay, Wes would like to know, what's the hardware you're using for the bubbler on the worm tea?
Great, that is Bubble Snake from the Compost Tea Lab, the website that I mentioned. They sell the snake alone, and then they also sell aerators and a whole kit that you can purchase. But you don't need to buy the fancy snake. You can use an aquarium stone. We've done that as well. And you can also make your own bubble snake with a bit of hose.
Yeah, drip irrigation hose works well.
The idea is just to increase the aeration as much as you can, as if you're making the actively aerated tea.
Great. Thank you, he says. So it looks like that might be it.
Oh, could I give a compliment?
Sure.
I've given these worm talks for 25 years and lecturing and I was waiting to find your mistakes and I didn't find a mistake. Dang it. You did a great job. You've carried on the tradition. Thank you. Because I'm not doing it anymore. And I learned a lot too, but I wish more people would go into the worm business or at least composting and encourage your friends to do it because it's fascinating. I still get the phone calls and everything and people are, like you said, the momentum's picking up. So we're encouraging people to recycle and compost and, it's fun. I'm still the worm lady. I'll always be the damn worm lady.
That's great.
Thank you.
I have no idea what that was.
She has a question.
I have one more question. Where do you get your cocoa core from? Who do you buy from?
I buy from Plantonics, and I sometimes use the evil Amazon to get it, but you can also buy directly from them, just a steeper shipping cost.
What was that name again?
Sorry, Plantonics.
Plantonics.
And it's organic?
It is organic. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's some question I've been reading up on where some of the cocoa core has been coming from different places, and I guess there's some controversy about how clean some of the cocoa core is. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with the controversy. I do know that it can be preferred to peat as organic matter, but for Plantonics, I'm not super familiar with their methods. I do know that it's washed so that there's not the high salinity, and that is great for growing. It's made specifically for growing, whereas I have gotten cocoa core that's just from the pet store and it's made for reptile cages, and I don't think it's the same quality.
No, I actually start some of my worms when I first got my worms with that stuff from the pet store, and it's okay for bedding for the worms, but yeah, I don't think I'd grow with it. Okay, thank you.
Of course, and I did see someone mention that it might have been you, that they use cocoa core for worm bedding, and that is a great bedding. Yeah, great. It is a great bedding. I was just trying to focus on what can you get for free, what's already out there, but cocoa core is definitely great.
A good source of free cocoa core is behind gardening supply places where they might discard old plants and plant baskets that have been bedded in cocoa core. Very often you can find a nice supply of that in a dumpster, or you can make arrangements with the garden supply people to save it for you.
And thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Good job, especially with all the PowerPoint. I never got to the PowerPoint phase. Great job. I'm jealous. Beautiful.
Well, I want to thank you too, Julia. So just out of curiosity, is there anything else that we need to know in terms of the resources? Everything is on the screen right now.
Yep, and there, through NOFA, there is the handout that I'm not sure how it's made accessible to the participants, but there is a handout out there. You can also always send us an email with more questions. We'd be happy to answer that. Yeah.
Yeah, I would encourage you to go to the auction if you're interested in, and we have some worm paraphernalia that you could bid on, and if it's of use to you, that would help support NOFA as well.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thank everybody for attending.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Thank
And
you
also,
very much.
don't forget to support our sponsors. Check out the vendor marketplace and check out the auction. Ben has remind me, Ben, what's in the auction?
There's a
Worm
worm bin, there's some castings, there's one of my getting started with worm composting booklets in there. I forget what all else. Oh, Julia has some,
we have some
Julia has a
microgreen.
microgreen kits available.
Great, thank you. And also, if you could also look in the chat, they have a link for your evaluation. I say thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. 5 stars.
Thank you.
Thanks,
You're
Fran.
welcome. Take care. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.